Secretary Buttigieg, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg. The U.S. has been engaging the Global South as a way to counter the influence and the role China plays in the global supply chain. How much traction have you had, bearing in mind that the Global South has been pushing back on the global order as we know it, wanting to remain neutral on a range of issues, including Ukraine, including U.S. China tensions?
Well, the way forward has to be one that regards every country and every region on its own terms and understands that there will be different approaches and different priorities from state to state, but at the same time that there is a shared level of need for a rules-based international order. And I think that what our message has been, especially as we've been engaging countries in the Global South, is that partnership is going to be vital on every issue, from stabilizing supply chains to global public health, and of course this climate challenge, which will be especially hard on some of those who are already the most vulnerable. That's why we are extending the hand of partnership to every willing partner. And you look at what has been achieved so far, you look at the possibilities for the years to come. I, of course, come at this in particular from the transportation perspective and see opportunities for collaboration and engagement in every part of the world.
The thing is, there's a sense the U.S. may be undercutting its commitment in some parts of Asia. When President Biden completed the G7 summit, he missed that stopover in Papua New Guinea. And we know that China is keen to explore infrastructure assets like deep water ports in the South Pacific. I mean, what do you say about U.S. commitment to some parts of Asia which are already neglected?
Well, I think we're demonstrating our commitment through the many projects, relationships, and efforts that we have underway, from the private sector and the social sector through to the work we're doing with international aid and the partnerships in transportation that we've been reinforcing, that we've been discussing here at the G7, that we were able to discuss at APEC with our many partners, including Papua New Guinea, who were represented there, and we were very pleased to host them in Detroit. Whether we're talking about ports, whether we're talking about the future of aviation, or any of the other issues that are at stake, we recognize that the way forward is going to be one that benefits countries on their terms, as well as being mutually beneficial for us. And we do see often some of these propositions coming in from other players that I think these countries recognize come with certain strings attached that may not be to the benefit of their future.
Are you concerned about China's ownership in container ports across the world? Might that be a hindrance, a problem for U.S. commercial and national security interests abroad?
Well, as we seek to de-risk and diversify our supply chains and our economic relationships, we do want to make sure that these capabilities are not concentrated with any one country. Certainly with a country that may demonstrate a willingness to use these in ways that are not connected to what is the best going forward, either commercially or in terms of that rules-based international order. We want to make sure that at least when we can agree on matters from climate change to public health, that we're operating on a basis that can be understood to be for the benefit of all. And those are the kinds of things we're focused on here at the G7.
You talk about de-risking. Are there any other sectors that need de-risking? Some point to perhaps even the drug sector in China. I mean, the world is reliant on basic drugs when it comes to, China.
Well, I want to make sure not to wander too far outside of my own portfolio. I know that these are subjects of active conversation, both bilaterally and multilaterally. What I can say with regard to supply chains is that we have seen how if there is not enough diversification, you see extraordinary levels of geopolitical risk or even just logistical risk, in the U.S. Because of the extreme variation between the closures and the reopenings in Asia and in China specifically. There's a great deal of unevenness in terms of the arrival of goods that our ports were not ready to take in all at once. I think that's one example of the kind of wake-up calls that the U.S. and that the global community in general have been experiencing, especially in the last 2 to 3 years.
Since we're talking about supply chains, of course, semiconductors front and center. We've had the Chip 4, U.S., Japan, Korea, Taiwan, investing heavily in their own respective semiconductor sectors. Could that lead to overcapacity? What's your assessment? How are you looking at it?
Well, right now, overcapacity seems to be the least of our problems when it comes to the race for semiconductors, and we saw how problematic it was when we came up short. Of course, this is a process where the very intentional, direct, and ambitious use of public policy has to match the unique ability of markets to allocate resources and to help make sure that the capacity is tracking the future of demand. But what we know is that semiconductors are going to be even more important in the future. We think about the automotive sector, for example, and the fact that a car is increasingly as much a computer as it is a vehicle. And the same could be said of so many other sectors. So rather than allow ourselves to again be in a situation where we're coming up short, we're making sure that both in terms of our relationships with friends and trading partners and in terms of our domestic capacity, which by the way has also benefited from foreign direct investment that's really helping to create jobs on U.S. soil while strengthening our partnerships and relationships across the Pacific. That is something that makes sense for the future and can help us to cushion some of the geopolitical risk that we're trying to de-risk and diversify away from.
That comes to friendshoring. We've had the likes of Japan trying to lure semiconductor players. We have TSMC setting up base, investing $8 billion, is looking at Micron, perhaps even making investments in Japan. Is that a kind of friendshoring that would help the U.S. move away from its reliance on chips made in Taiwan?
Well, friendshoring is certainly something that I think we're being more and more intentional about, not just with regard to semiconductors, but as the supply chain for electric vehicles becomes more and more central to the U.S. automotive sector and to the global automotive sector. This is not a matter of believing that every single element of a battery, for example, can come from one country. That's a matter of physics or geology, and it's not always possible. But it does mean making sure that we have the relationships, not just for the raw materials, but things like refining capacity. Refining capacity on many of the key raw materials needed for EV battery components is very concentrated in China. And that is something that's addressable. It's not a matter of geology, it's a matter of capacity. And we need to make sure, both in terms of what we're building up domestically in the United States and our relationships with friends and trading partners, that we're positioning ourselves to have an economically sensible, environmentally sensible, and geopolitically stable approach to how we are going to get these vitally important elements in our economy that are only going to grow in importance on the road to 2050, where we need to make sure that by then we've reached our climate goals.
You talked about EVs, the big boys, the likes of GM, Ford. They've come forward to say that, you know what, they're ready to adopt Tesla's superchargers. How do you look at that? Will that perhaps make it even more difficult for your department to have oversight over Tesla's autopilot?
We view the relationship that's been established in terms of chargers as a positive development. Our biggest concern is simply to make sure that a good, strong charging network is available. In other words, as a U.S. government, we're not out to pick winners and losers and say that this company or this company's standard is better than the others. We did establish a baseline in terms of access to a certain connector to make sure that everybody knew what to expect, but that was designed to be a floor and not a ceiling. Likewise, with chargers more generally, we're establishing certain rules, especially for any charger that benefits from U.S. government subsidies, making sure that the pricing is transparent, making sure there's a high standard of reliability, making sure they're interoperable so that there's no walled garden where you are confined to a membership with one company in order to access chargers. And what's remarkable about the relationship that's been established, for example, with Ford and Tesla, is it means that many more drivers will have access to those chargers. And look, no one has more experience in deploying chargers across the United States than Tesla. Now, it's also important to remember that while connectors are a key part, of course, in the charging of an electric vehicle, they are a part that is adaptable. There can be adapters. This is why I think the format war analogy to the days of VHS and Betamax, for example, doesn't fully fit here. The biggest challenges we've seen with installing and maintaining chargers have to do with the utilities, the site readiness. When you add up all of the challenges in terms of getting a good charger up and running, the connector is not your biggest problem.
Is it fair then to say that you are comfortable with Tesla superchargers being the de facto standard?
Well, in terms of the connector, I think, again, we want to make sure that if you have a CCS car, you can get access to charging. But if things evolve in the direction of that NACS standard that Tesla has developed, the most important thing is that we ultimately get a kind of convergence. And again, this is an area where we're not focused so much on putting the thumb on the scale for this company or that company. We are putting a thumb on the scale for making sure that EVs develop quickly enough to help us meet our climate goals in a way that creates good paying American jobs and on an equitable basis, because often some of the people who would most stand to benefit from the cost savings of EV ownership might not have access to that if, for example, they live in a multifamily dwelling where it's not yet profitable for the private sector alone to be installing chargers. That's where we come in and help.
You also oversee aviation. Is there a sense when the U.S. will increase the number of weekly flights for carriers that ply the U.S. China route? I mean, is there a time frame that we're looking at?
That's an ongoing conversation, and will largely reflect conditions and what's going on in that bilateral aviation relationship. What I will say is that this is a challenging and sensitive moment for international aviation, especially because of what Russian aggression against Ukraine has done to complicate our ability to maneuver. The inability to fly over Russian airspace, obviously not an appropriate thing for U.S. carriers to be doing, is unfortunately something that some other carriers can use to create a competitive advantage. But we've also seen a great deal of solidarity among many of our like-minded friends and partners when it comes to those routes. And these are the kinds of things that when you start with one route or one country pair, begin cascading into some of the others. On the other hand, there's also a remarkable level of cooperation on aviation priorities, not just to make sure that there's safe and equitable access to the skies, but also to make sure that this, which is maybe the hardest sector to decarbonize, becomes more sustainable. And I was pleased, even here at this G7 conversation, for us to see a good level of alignment around the adoption of sustainable aviation fuels that will, I think, really only be successful if there is multilateral participation and cooperation to get it done.
It is really about bringing the cost down, but linked to that, Boeing looking to resume its deliveries of the MAX jets to China. Is there a sense when that might be happen? How are you trying to push this along with the Chinese government?
Well, our focus from the FAA's standpoint and the U.S. Department of Transportation is simply on the certification and safety. The rest is a market matter, one that obviously there's a lot of interest from a trade perspective, but we're very cautious in our administration, certainly in my department, to separate trade questions from safety questions, and the safety questions are our top focus.
Secretary Buttigieg, I want to touch on U.S. infrastructure, the sad state of U.S. infrastructure. My crew and I got here in Ise-Shima on the bullet train, the Shinkansen. You can't help but juxtapose Japan infrastructure with U.S. infrastructure. Why is Japan's infrastructure way more superior than that of the U.S.?
Well, we've inherited about 50 years of U.S. policy that did a lot of work to move cars quickly, and we can all agree that it's important to have efficient ways of moving cars around, but really at the expense of important alternatives. Right now, we're working to make sure that we have a more balanced transportation future. Of course, we're investing, as a matter of fact, the most we have in more than half a century, to improve our car infrastructure, to have better designed and more durable roads and bridges. But we also have to make sure, especially given what we now know about climate change, that there are strong alternatives like better passenger rail. Now, President Biden famously is somebody who is a passionate believer in passenger rail. So am I. And what we have in the historic infrastructure law as part of the $1.2 trillion package of investments that the president is leading is the biggest investment in American passenger rail since our system, Amtrak, was created in the first place over 50 years ago. Part of that's a matter of repairing what we have, but part of it is a matter of enhancing, adding, and improving on the infrastructure that we've inherited. It won't happen overnight, but I'm confident that this legislation and this work we are undertaking right now is going to lead to substantially improved options for passenger rail in the United States.
Is the outdated infrastructure in the U.S. impinging on growth and the economy? What's your take on that?
Well, part of the case we made in arguing for this historic infrastructure bill is that we are paying the price for decades of disinvestment and underfunding. Maybe at the time it appeared like a savings, but it's no more a savings than putting off a fix on a leaky roof is a savings. Sooner or later, that catches up to you. But that's one of the reasons why I'm so proud to be working on the investments we now have underway. This is the level of infrastructure investment that previous presidents and administrations have promised but not been able to deliver. This time is different, and we spent our first year as an administration getting that bill passed. We spent our second year creating the programs that the bill funded. Now, in this third year of the life of the Biden-Harris administration, we are very focused on getting the money moving, and as we say, getting the dirt flying, the actual construction. And it's going everywhere from some of our biggest airports and most recognizable roads and bridges to rural areas that have needed something that might sound very simple and minor, like eliminating a railway crossing. But if that railroad crossing was blocking emergency vehicles or becoming a constant headache because trains were delayed or blocked on it, this is a major quality of life and even safety issue for the communities. And so whether we're talking about ports and airports, roads and bridges, trains and transit, this is a generational investment that, by the way, also has the enormous benefit of creating a generation's worth of good paying, skilled jobs for the American people.
The collapse of I-95, would that be a catalyst for the U.S. to perhaps relook at all its highways, reinvest to make it better?
Well, importantly, while there have been cases in recent years where in the middle of an ordinary day, a piece of infrastructure failed, this is a little bit different. What happened here was an inferno, a collision where a tanker truck exploded directly beneath an elevated highway. Even a modern and recently built highway can only withstand so much heat under it before it begins to fail, and that's what happened here. But I would also say, I think it's a real tribute to the ingenuity of people on the ground, the engineers and the workers, that the president was able to be there yesterday as they announced a solution where we would have expected it to take months to get cars moving on that roadway again. In fact, within weeks, they're going to be able to get that done with novel approaches to filling that back in. And that's a big part of what we have to do, not only to work harder, but to work smarter, to make sure that the dollars we have go further so that we can more quickly deliver results, whether it's dealing with an emergency like I-95 or whether it's building infrastructure meant to last for 100 years.
The thing is it even viable, feasible for the I-95 to reopen in 2 weeks? I mean, what's making it possible now when you compare it to maybe the I-85 bridge that collapsed, which took several months?
That's right, yeah. We had relatively recent experience with a somewhat comparable incident that took place a few years ago. What they're doing this time, and I had a chance as I visited the mobile command center to hold this in my hand, is use a form of material made of recycled glass that can be compressed into sort of bricks that then can be paved over, so that while the permanent work of restoring the bridge takes place, they can do that in stages while still having more than half of the original capacity of I-95 running while those repairs are taking place. And this is what I mean when I talk about being creative and innovative while also being safe in finding solutions to these issues. Every time we can find a way to do something better than we did a year ago or 10 years ago, we're going to apply that to get the most, as we say, the most bang for our buck.
There's a lot of talk about emergency funds, and some say that perhaps some money should have been set aside in the infrastructure law in 2021 for emergency funds. How are you looking at it? Is it something that you'll be looking at in the future?
Well, we do have emergency funds. They're just funded on a different basis, and a good example is that Pennsylvania, as they're fixing I-95, has resources, access to all the resources they need through our reimbursement programs and a facility that we call Quick Release that's already gotten millions of dollars available to them. But let me say this, we are also, for the first time, investing in a dedicated fashion in resilience. We have a program created by the President's infrastructure law called Protect. Over $7 billion going into resilient infrastructure, from seismic retrofits to making sure that we get out of this mode where if, for example, what used to be a 500-year flood becomes a regular occurrence, we're not just telling the community to rebuild the road the same way every year it gets washed out, but funding them to move it to a place that is more secure. The best way to handle these emergencies is to try to prevent them from happening in the first place. And we know that what worked 50 years ago or 100 years ago, with today's climate pressures and today's knowledge, it's going to be different.
I want to pivot to your political career and perhaps the upcoming election. We have President Biden gearing up for his second term. Would you be interested in being part of his administration if he were to win the presidency again?
Well, serving under this president's leadership is an enormous honor, and I'm very focused on making sure that I deliver on the many things he's assigned to me and my department, and the rest hopefully will take care of itself if we do as good a job as is required of us. Our department has never been asked to use the tools that we're now using to deliver the funding that we're now delivering. It's enormous pressure and an enormous opportunity, and I'm humbled that the president has entrusted me with delivering this work.
But would you be interested in being part of his second administration?
You know, that's for the president to discuss and decide. But right now, I'm focused on this term, this administration, and this job, and doing the best that I possibly can.
A poll done by the New Hampshire University suggests that you have a 23% rating among likely Dems voters versus the president's 18%. They want you to be their candidate for 2024. How do you respond to that?
You know, anyone can find some poll that says something provocative. Our focus is to really just deliver. You know, we're at a moment where if you look at what's been achieved over the last 2.5 years, some of the most significant economic legislation that we've seen in more than a half century, this infrastructure package that has escaped previous presidents and previous Congresses for as long as I've been alive. The climate ambition represented by the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS work that's going on. So many things have happened just in that short amount of time that now we've got to stay focused on delivery. If we stay focused on delivery and we get it done, I'm confident the politics take care of themselves.
What would it take for you to run in 2024?
That's not even in the universe of the things that I'm thinking about right now.
A lot of chatter since that interview done with Ron DeSantis, where you talked about how he's not speaking to you. How are you looking at his bid to be president?
You know, I'll stay away from the campaign side because I'm here in an official capacity, but let me say this. I am puzzled that a governor in a role as important as his, or frankly any elected official in the United States, given all of the things that they are asked to confront, everything from disaster response to infrastructure to the economic pressures their people are facing, decide to make such a priority of stoking culture wars. He really seems to be more interested in battling Disney than battling some of the challenges that the people he serves are facing. We're not going to let that get in the way of us doing good work for the people of Florida. They actually have a very good, effective Department of Transportation there. We've worked with them on everything from more parking for cargo trucks, which is a big issue across the country, including in Florida, to making sure there's more capacity in their ports. And I'm doing everything I can to keep the politics off to the side, because the president has instructed me and everybody in the cabinet to make sure that we are doing work that benefits every community, so-called red states, blue states, purple states, places that voted for this president and places that didn't, because as the saying goes, we all do better when we all do better.
You have an impressive resume. Oxford, Harvard, Rhodes Scholar, Intel officer in the U.S. Navy, having served in Afghanistan as well, also the youngest transport secretary in U.S. history. And you're also the first openly gay secretary in cabinet. Do you think the U.S. is ready for a gay president?
Well, you know, before I think about this as a politician, I think about this as a father. As we're talking, it's Father's Day.
Yes. And, Happy Father's Day.
And my husband Chasten and I are raising an amazing son and daughter, our twins. And I am hopeful that we are getting closer to a future in which families like mine know that we are supported and protected the same as any other family. Again, in this administration, the president has led a lot of work to do just that, notably the Respect for Marriage Act that establishes protections for marriages like the one that is at the core of my family, household, and life. But there's still a long way to go when it comes to legal protections and when it comes to the treatment of LGBTQ Americans. And this Pride Month, our hope is that we continue to make forward strides, that those voices that try to get some kind of political advantage by picking on what are already often vulnerable and marginalized people find a different place to put their energies, like making life easier for everybody.
So at this stage, the U.S. is not ready for a gay president then? Is that what you're saying?
No, again, I'm not here to talk about presidential politics. I answered that question by running for president a few years ago.
Yes.
And now I have the honor of serving a president who's doing such remarkable work leading our country into a new future. And from the chunk of that agenda that he's asked me to work on, have a lot on my plate that I'm proud to be trying to deliver.
And if you were to run again and win, what would be your priorities for the good of the U.S.?
I'm not here to speculate on the priorities of any presidency but the one that I serve under. And the one that I serve under, the Biden-Harris administration, is one that, even in 2.5 years, has already achieved more than most American presidencies did in 4 or in 8, which is why I'm so excited about the work we're going to continue to do, and why I feel a lot of pressure to keep any other distractions at bay while we get that work done. Look, just because we've been given a sum of funding that is more than the GDP of most countries doesn't mean that we're going to have good results unless we actually use it well, use it wisely, use it in concert with the lessons that we can learn from international partners and from around the world. There are some things that I would argue we do better than anybody in the United States. But when you take a ride on the Shinkansen bullet train, you also see there are so many areas in which we have a lot to learn. Getting that right, doing our job well, that's more than enough to consume more than 100% of my professional and political attention.